The day James Bancroft decided he would not move from his spot at the trading post counter was the same day Alice Bell walked through the door and changed every stubborn plan he had ever made. It was the spring of 1873, and the town of Redrock Crossing, Texas, sat baking beneath a sky so wide and blue it made a man feel small if he thought about it too hard. James Bancroft made a point of not thinking too hard about most things. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair shot through with the first threads of gray at his temples. He had a jaw built for clenching and eyes the color of creek water after a storm, greenish-gray and difficult to read. He had worked as a ranch hand, a cattle driver, a fence mender, and had spent 2 seasons as a scout for a land surveying company before he had eventually come to Redrock Crossing and decided, with the kind of absolute finality only truly stubborn men achieve, that he was staying. He had taken a job helping old Silas Dobbins run the trading post. Silas was 67, half-blind, and moved like a man whose joints had been assembled incorrectly by someone who had lost the instructions. He needed James to lift things, count things, and occasionally throw troublemakers out the door. James needed a roof and a purpose, and Silas provided both without asking too many questions, which was the precise quality James valued most in an employer. The trading post was the center of Redrock Crossing in every practical sense. It sat at the crossing of 2 dirt roads, one running east to west and the other running north toward the cattle ranches that sprawled out across the flat land like sleeping giants. The building itself was wide and low, built from rough-cut timber that had grayed over the years, with a broad porch where men sat on barrel tops and crates to argue about weather and cattle prices and the general unfairness of life. Inside, it smelled of dried beans, leather, gun oil, and the particular sweetness of brown sugar kept in open sacks. Shelves lined every wall, packed with everything a person might need to survive in a country that was still making up its mind about whether it wanted to be civilized. James had been working at the trading post for 2 years when people started calling him stubborn, and he had been working there for 6 months before he actually earned the name. The trouble had started when a cattle rancher named Harlan Voss had come in and demanded that Silas keep a special stock of imported tobacco exclusively for him, at a price well below what it cost Silas to carry it. Silas, who was too old and too tired to argue with anyone who carried a louder voice than him, had been inclined to say yes. James had said no. Harlan Voss had threatened, cajoled, and eventually attempted to bribe James with a side of smoked pork, and James had stood at that counter and said no each time with the same flat, unruffled tone that made people unsure whether he simply did not care about the pork or whether he was genuinely incapable of changing his mind once it was set. He was, in fact, genuinely incapable of changing his mind once it was set. That was the honest truth of it, and most people in Redrock Crossing had come to understand this the way they understood weather patterns. James Bancroft said what he meant and meant what he said, and once he had decided something, it was as fixed as the horizon line. He would not overcharge the struggling homesteaders who came in with barely enough coin to get through winter. He would not underpay the farmers who brought goods to trade. He would not tolerate dishonesty in the ledger or cruelty on the porch, and he enforced these positions with such absolute quiet certainty that even men twice his size tended to reconsider before pressing their luck. This had earned him respect from the people who needed protecting and irritation from the people who preferred to do the exploiting. Both groups agreed on one thing, which was that James Bancroft was the most stubborn man at the trading post. Some of them said it like a curse and some of them said it like a compliment, but they all said it, and James took it as neither. He took it as a fact, like the color of his eyes or the length of his legs, something he had been given and had long since decided to keep. He was standing behind the counter on the 3rd Tuesday of April, 1873, checking a supply manifest against the actual contents of a crate of canned goods, when the door opened and let in a blast of warm spring air along with Alice Bell. He did not look up immediately. The door opened and closed many times a day, and he had learned to sort visitors by the sound of their footsteps before bothering to raise his eyes from whatever he was counting. These footsteps were lighter than most, deliberate without being tentative, the kind of steps that suggested someone who knew exactly where they were going, but was being careful not to disturb anything along the way. He looked up. She was somewhere in her late 20s, perhaps 28 or 29, though the sun and the prairie had a way of making it difficult to guess ages with any confidence. She was not tall, but she carried herself like someone who had decided long ago that height was beside the point. Her hair was dark brown, nearly black, and pinned up under a hat that had seen better days, a wide-brimmed thing that was slightly misshapen on one side, as though it had survived something difficult. Her dress was practical and worn at the cuffs, a faded blue that had probably once been the same blue as a summer evening sky. She had brown eyes, the warm amber-brown kind that caught light well, and just now those eyes were moving across the shelves with focused, careful attention, the way a person looks when they are trying to figure out if they can afford what they need. She was carrying a child on her hip. A boy, James guessed, maybe 3 years old, with the same dark hair as his mother and a piece of dried corn he was studying with intense intellectual curiosity. There was a second child, a girl older, perhaps 5 or 6, holding her mother's free hand and looking around the trading post with the sharp, fascinated eyes of a child who finds the whole world interesting. James watched them for a moment, then returned his eyes to the manifest, because it was not his habit to stare. He heard her approach the counter, and he set the manifest aside and looked up again. "Afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was even clear, with a slight formality to it that suggested she had been raised somewhere with more schooling than most of the territory. "I am told this is where I would find general provisions." "It is," James said. "What do you need?" She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper, which she unfolded carefully and placed on the counter between them. It was a list, written in small, neat handwriting. James looked at it. Flour, salt, dried beans, bacon, lamp oil, a length of cotton sheeting, thread, 2 boxes of matches. "I have cash money," she said before he could ask. There was a quiet dignity in the way she said it, not defensive exactly, but deliberate, as though she had said things like this before and had learned to say them first. "All right," James said. He began moving around the counter to pull the items. Silas Dobbins appeared from the back room, squinting through his spectacles at the woman and children with the expression of a man trying to remember whether he had met them before. "Help you, miss," he said, because Silas always said this to anyone he encountered, regardless of whether James was already helping them, as though the trading post operated on a first-come, first-served basis that Silas personally administered. "Mr. Bancroft is already helping me, thank you," she said pleasantly, and Silas nodded and wandered back toward the rear of the store, satisfied. James brought the flour first, a 10-pound sack, and set it on the counter. "You new to the area?" he asked. He did not usually make conversation, but there was something about her list, specifically the neatness of it and the precision of the quantities, that suggested she had been thinking about it carefully for some time. "I am," she said. "I came in from Austin 2 days ago. I have taken up the Dawson homestead on the North Road." James paused in the act of reaching for the salt. The Dawson homestead on the North Road was 40 acres of fairly decent land that had been standing empty for 3 years since Pete Dawson had broken his leg badly in a horse accident, and then died of the infection before summer ended. His widow had gone to live with her sister in San Antonio, and the property had sat unclaimed, slowly accruing taxes, until someone had apparently bought it or leased it or otherwise acquired it. "That is a good piece of land," James said carefully, because it was true. It was also a significant piece of land for one woman with 2 small children. "I believe it is," she said. She shifted the boy on her hip. He had finished examining the dried corn and was now examining a button on his mother's collar with the same focused attention. James finished gathering her items, moving through the store with the efficient economy of a man who knew where everything was without having to look for it. He brought each item to the counter and arranged them as he set them down, grouping them by size without thinking about it, the way someone does when orderliness is less a choice than a habit. "I am Alice Bell," she said when he was back behind the counter tallying the total. He looked up at her. "James Bancroft." She nodded as though that confirmed something she had already suspected. "This is my son Thomas," she said, tipping her chin toward the boy, "and this is my daughter Clara." Clara, the older girl, looked up at James with the direct, assessing gaze that young children sometimes possess before they learn to be polite about it. "You are very tall," she said. "Clara," her mother said gently. "That is all right," James said. He looked at Clara. "You are very right." Clara seemed satisfied with this and went back to examining a display of ribbon spools that Silas kept near the end of the counter for no clear reason, since almost nobody bought them. James wrote the total in the ledger and named the figure to Alice Bell. She counted out coins from a small leather purse, placing them on the counter one by one, and James watched her count and did not say anything about the fact that she counted twice, once quietly with her lips moving slightly and once again more openly, to be sure. She was 73 cents short. She stood still for a moment, looking at the coins, and James could see her recalculating. "I can leave the sheeting," she said, "and one of the boxes of matches." "That brings it to the right amount," James said. She nodded, and he took those 2 items back off the counter. She gathered the rest into the canvas bag she had brought, moving with practiced efficiency, distributing the weight evenly and resettling Thomas on her hip. Clara came back from the ribbon display carrying one small spool of red ribbon in her hand and held it up toward her mother. "Please, Mama," she said. "Not today, sweetheart," Alice said, and Clara put the ribbon back without argument, which told James something about how accustomed they both were to this kind of answer. Alice Bell picked up her bag, adjusted Thomas again, and offered James a brief, composed smile. "Thank you, Mr. Bancroft." "Ma'am," he said. She walked to the door, and Clara followed, and the door closed behind them, and James stood at the counter for a moment looking at the place where she had been, then turned back to his manifest and picked it up again. But he found, somewhat to his own irritation, that he could not quite locate his place on the list. He had to start from the beginning. He saw her 3 more times that week, which was not unusual given that the trading post was the only general store within 12 miles. Each time she came in with a list and with the children, and each time her transactions were crisp and orderly and correct down to the last cent. On her second visit she had the exact amount for what she needed, and she explained this, unprompted, by saying that she had taken better stock of her stores before making the list. James found he was paying attention to these visits in a way he did not pay attention to most things that were not directly related to the running of the trading post. On her 4th visit, she came in during a dispute. The dispute involved Harlan Voss, the same cattle rancher who had previously tried to bribe James with smoked pork, and a young homesteader named Owen Pratt who was 20 years old and had arrived in Redrock Crossing the previous autumn with a wife, $30, and more optimism than the territory generally rewarded. Owen had come in to get ammunition for his rifle, which he needed because something had been getting into his livestock at night, and he had the money for it. Harlan Voss, who was in the store at the same time buying rope, had decided to spend a portion of his time making remarks about how homesteaders like Owen Pratt were ruining good cattle land with their fencing and their corn and their general presence. James had already told Harlan, once and quietly, to go about his business and leave the boy alone. Harlan had not gone about his business. He was the kind of man who measured himself against other men by how much he could push them, and he pushed because he was accustomed to not being pushed back. He had a loud voice and a wide face reddened by drink and weather, and he was in the middle of a comment about how homesteaders ought to go back east to wherever they came from when Alice Bell walked through the door. She assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, the way James had observed intelligent people tended to do, reading the room before they entered it fully. She moved to the side of the store and began looking at the goods on the shelves, keeping the children close, and did not appear to be listening. James looked at Harlan. "Last time," he said. "You do not own this store," Harlan said. "No," James said. "I just run it. Either buy the rope and leave or leave without it." Harlan looked at James with the expression of a man conducting a private calculation about whether pushing further was worth the price, and apparently decided it was not, because he dropped the money for the rope on the counter, picked up the coil, and walked out. The door banged behind him. Owen Pratt let out a breath. "Thank you," he said, quietly enough that it was mostly meant for James alone. "Get what you need," James said. After Owen had gone, Alice Bell came to the counter with her small list. She looked at James as she set it down. "Does that happen often?" she asked. "Often enough," James said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her list, and then she said, "It is difficult being somewhere new, when people decide you do not belong." James glanced at her. There was something in the way she said it that suggested she was not speaking entirely about Owen Pratt. "Some people decide that about others," James said. "Does not make them right." She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression, a brief, clear moment of something he could not quite name, and then she looked back at her list and the moment passed. He noticed, after she had gone, that Silas was watching him from the back of the store with the expression of an elderly man who had seen considerably more of life than he let on. "What?" James said. "Nothing," Silas said, in the tone of someone who meant the opposite. As April moved into May and May began to warm toward June, Alice Bell became a regular presence at the trading post in the way that certain people became regular presences in a place, not just by showing up frequently, but by becoming, somehow, part of the texture of it. She knew where things were now, and she moved through the store with confidence, and she always had her list, and she always had her money ready. And Clara had graduated from examining the ribbon spools to having occasional brief, serious conversations with James about topics of her choosing, which so far had included horses, the color of the sky in the morning versus the evening, and whether or not dried beans could be made to taste good if you tried hard enough. "They can," James had confirmed on that last subject. "You need enough salt and time." Clara had considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Mama uses salt," she said. "We need more time." Thomas, who was at an age where language was still more aspiration than achievement, had begun greeting James with a solemn wave upon entry, which James returned with equal solemnity, and which Silas found so funny he had nearly knocked a jar of hard candy off the counter the first time he witnessed it. James did not think of himself as a man who attached to people easily. His life had been marked more by movement than by rootedness until these past 2 years, and even now that he had stopped moving, he had kept his attachments minimal by inclination. He liked Silas, in the way you like a crooked old piece of furniture that has come to feel essential. He got along well enough with the other men in town. He was civil to everyone and close to no one, which was the precise arrangement he had decided suited him. He was beginning to notice that Alice Bell was making this arrangement feel, for the first time, somewhat lacking. He could not have said exactly when this had happened, which irritated him because he preferred things to be specific and traceable. It had not been a single moment. It had been the accumulation of many small things, the neat lists. The way she counted her money with that quiet, relentless practicality, never embarrassed by the amounts, never apologetic, just accurate. The way she handled her children, patient but direct, never performing patience for an audience the way some people did. The things she said, which were always exactly as long as they needed to be, no more and no less. And the fact that she was doing something James knew from experience was extraordinarily hard, which was surviving alone in a place that did not make survival easy, with 2 children and 40 acres, and what he estimated was not very much money. And she was doing it with a kind of sustained, clear-eyed determination that made him feel a complicated thing he did not have a ready name for. He knew she was a widow. He did not know the details, and he did not ask, because it was not his habit to ask people things they had not offered. He knew her husband was gone and had been gone for some time, longer than the recent move would suggest, because there was a kind of settled, incorporated quality to her aloneness, as though it were not a wound still healing, but something she had finished incorporating into herself, and was simply carrying now as part of her daily weight. One afternoon in early June, she came in without the children. He had not seen her without the children before, and the absence of them changed the quality of the visit in a way he could not immediately account for. She seemed, without them, slightly different, not smaller but somehow less distributed, more concentrated, as though she were entirely present in a way that was different when she had to distribute herself across 3 people's needs at once. "Clara is at the neighbor's," she said, which was the explanation he had not asked for. "Thomas is asleep." "You left a sleeping 3-year-old alone," he said before he could stop himself. She gave him a look. "I left him in the care of my neighbor's eldest daughter, who is 15 and perfectly capable. I ran here and I will run back." She paused. "I have 12 minutes." Despite himself, he almost smiled. "Then we should not waste them." He moved efficiently through her list, which she had memorized today and did not need to read. He noticed she had added the cotton sheeting back, which meant she had found the money for it since that first visit, and he felt something that he supposed was satisfaction, though it was mixed with something more complicated. When everything was tallied and paid for, she said, "Mr. Bancroft." He looked up. "I need a fair price on a used plow," she said. "I was told you sometimes know of such things." He did sometimes know of such things, because the trading post was not just a store but an informal clearinghouse for the entire district, a place where people left word of what they needed and what they had to sell, and James kept track of all of it in a running mental ledger that Silas relied on almost entirely. "Pete Maddox has one he is not using," James said. "Needs work, but the frame is sound. He would likely take $3 for it." She was quiet. $3 was not nothing. "I can sharpen the blade for you if you bring it in," James added. "I have the tools for it." She looked at him. "That is kind of you," she said. "It is practical," he said. "A dull plow is a waste of your time." She picked up her bag. She was about to leave, and he was about to let her when something moved in him, some contrary current he had not consulted before it acted. "Mrs. Bell," he said. She paused, turned. "How are you finding the homestead?" he asked. It was not the question he had meant to ask, and he was not sure what he had meant to ask instead, but it was the question that came out. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was considering something carefully. "It is good land," she said. "The well is solid. The house needs work, but the bones are right." She paused. "It is lonely," she said then, and said it the way she said things, without apology and without drama, just accurate. James stood very still. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I imagine it is." She looked at him and he looked at her, and there was something in the air between them that was entirely new and that both of them, he suspected, recognized. "I should go," she said. "You should," he said. "You have about 4 minutes left." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a real laugh, not the polite social version people produced for courtesy. It was quick and bright and entirely genuine, and it did something to him that he could feel all the way to the soles of his boots. She went out the door, and James stood where he was for a moment. Behind him, Silas said, from where he had been pretending to arrange dried herbs for the past 10 minutes, "That is a fine woman." "Mind your business, Silas," James said. "This is my business," Silas said serenely. "She comes in here 8 times a month." "She needs supplies," James said. "People who need supplies go to a store," Silas said. "People who keep coming back to the same store are looking for something else." James turned and looked at the old man. "Or maybe they just like the service," Silas said, examining a bundle of dried sage with excessive interest, the corners of his mouth turned upward. 3 days later, Alice Bell came in with both children again, and James had the plow information written down on a slip of paper with Pete Maddox's farm directions on it. He gave it to her. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. "Thank you," she said. "He is a fair man," James said. "Tell him I sent you and he will not try to take advantage." She gave him a look that suggested she thought she was capable of managing Pete Maddox on her own, which was probably true, but she said, "I will tell him," because she understood the gesture. It was 2 weeks after that when the question happened. The question that changed everything. It was a Saturday, which was the busiest day at the trading post because the surrounding farms and ranches sent people in on Saturdays when there was no school and when the week's work had reached a natural pause. The store was full of people, 8 or 10 of them at any given moment, and James was busy. He had been on his feet since before sunrise, handling deliveries from a supply wagon, and he was tired in the particular way that comes from a long day of being needed by everyone simultaneously. Alice Bell came in at mid-morning with Clara and Thomas, and she moved through her shopping without coming to the counter immediately because there were 2 other people ahead of her. James was aware of her in the store in the same background way he had become aware of her in general, the way you become aware of a lamp in a room, not always looking at it but always knowing it is there. He was in the middle of weighing out sugar for a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who was very particular about the exact weight of her sugar and checked the scale every single time, when he heard Harlan Voss come in. He heard him before he saw him because Harlan had a voice built for cattle drives, a voice designed to be audible across significant distances. And today, he was using it to continue a conversation he had been having outside with 2 of his ranch hands, a conversation about the Dawson homestead and the woman who had taken it up. The remarks Harlan made were the kind of remarks that men like Harlan made about women alone on the frontier, remarks that were not outright vicious, but were built from the kind of dismissive contempt that assumed a woman's competence was a performance and her independence a temporary inconvenience until someone more appropriate came along to take charge of her situation. They were the kind of remarks that did their damage through tone and implication rather than through specific words, and they were aimed, with the unfailing accuracy of casual cruelty, at someone who was standing 10 feet away in the same room. James saw Alice Bell's back go straight. He saw Clara look up at her mother's face. He set down the scoop he was using for the sugar. "Harlan," he said. Harlan turned, surprised to be addressed so directly. "Bancroft." "You are in my store," James said. "Not your bunkhouse. Act accordingly." There was a silence in the trading post that was the particular silence of a room full of people who have all decided to be very interested in whatever is nearest to them. Harlan's face went through several calculations. He had pushed at James before and lost every time, but the presence of his ranch hands made backing down a more expensive proposition than usual, at least in terms of how he thought about it. "I am just talking," Harlan said. "You are just leaving," James said. One of the ranch hands actually took a step toward the door before Harlan had made a decision, which made the decision for Harlan, because a man could not pretend to be the one choosing to leave if his own men were already doing it. Harlan left. The door did not quite bang this time. He closed it with more deliberateness than usual, which was its own kind of statement. The store returned to the sound of ordinary commerce. James finished weighing Mrs. Patterson's sugar, which she checked twice and declared acceptable, and then she left, and the next person in line stepped up, and gradually the room worked its way through itself and thinned out. When Alice Bell came to the counter with her things, she set them down as she always did. She tallied, she paid, and she was about to collect her bag when she paused. She looked at him. She looked at him in that direct way she had, the way that suggested she was not particularly interested in approaching things sideways. "Mr. Bancroft," she said. "Mrs. Bell," he said. She was quiet for just a moment in the particular way of someone choosing words with precision. Clara was at the ribbon spools. Thomas was sitting on the floor examining his own shoe with complete absorption, "Why do you do it?" she asked. He looked at her. "Do what?" "Stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves," she said. "Owen Pratt, the first time I came in me just now, there have been others. Silas told me once that you once turned a man away who tried to shortchange a Tonkawa trapper for his goods. You do it every time. You never seem to count the cost. You never seem to wonder if it is worth it." She paused. "Why?" James opened his mouth, and then he closed it. Because the honest answer, the real answer, was not one he had ever been asked for before, and had therefore never had to find the words for. He had done these things because they were obviously the right things to do, and the obviousness of it had always felt like enough of an explanation. But she was not asking him to defend the actions. She was asking him something deeper than that, asking him what was underneath the doing of it, what need or principle or wound or conviction had built the man who stood in this trading post and refused to be moved. And he did not, in that moment, have the answer ready. He was a man who had an answer for everything. He was a man who did not hesitate. He was a man who decided and held and did not waver. And this woman had just asked him one question he could not answer. And he stood there in the long, sunlit interior of Silas Dobbin's trading post looking at Alice Bell as though she had removed a floorboard he had been standing on without knowing it was there. "I do not know," he said at last. It came out quietly, and with a directness that surprised even him, because a man like James Bancroft did not say "I do not know." He said things like "that is not how it works" or "that is not your concern." He did not say "I do not know." Alice Bell looked at him for a long moment. "I think you do know," she said. "I think you have just never been asked." She picked up her bag. She called Clara away from the ribbon spools. She collected Thomas from the floor, and she left. James stood at that counter for a full 3 minutes after the door closed, not moving, not reaching for anything, not counting or listing or weighing. Just standing there in the particular silence of a man who has just been shown something true about himself by someone he was not expecting. Silas appeared from the back. "Well," Silas said. James said nothing. "She is something," Silas said. "Yes," James said. "She is." He did not go home that evening thinking about supply lines or inventory or the fence on the north pasture that someone had mentioned needed repairing. He went home thinking about Alice Bell's question, rolling it over the way you roll a smooth stone in your palm, feeling all its edges. Why do you do it? He lay in his bunk in the small room behind the trading post that Silas let him use, and he looked at the ceiling and he thought about the question the way he had rarely thought about anything, turning it over and over and trying to find the true bottom of it. He thought about his mother, who had been widowed young, younger than Alice Bell by several years, and who had raised James and his 2 younger sisters on the Texas frontier with the same kind of quiet, implacable determination that he recognized in Alice Bell, the way you recognize the shape of something you know from a different angle. He thought about the men who had taken advantage of her, the landlord who had raised the rent when he knew she had no alternative, the merchant who had sold her bad flour at good flour prices because she was alone and would not cause trouble, the neighbors who had pitied her loudly in a way that was mostly about themselves. He thought about how he had watched all of that growing up and how it had built something in him, some deep and absolute refusal to participate in that kind of arrangement. He thought about how he had never in his life articulated any of this to anyone. He thought about Alice Bell saying, "I think you do know. I think you have just never been asked." He thought about that for a long time. The next morning he went to the trading post early, before Silas had finished his breakfast, and he opened the store and he stood behind the counter, and he thought about it some more while he arranged a display of harness buckles that did not particularly need arranging. When Pete Maddox came in later that morning, James said, "Did a Mrs. Bell come to see you about the plow?" Pete scratched his chin. "Came out 2 days ago, offered me $250. James raised his eyebrows. $3 was the price he had suggested, $250 was lower, which meant she had negotiated. "I took it," Pete said. "She was right that it needed work." "She was," James agreed. "Sharp woman," Pete said. She also pointed out the blade had a crack I had not noticed, and said she would only take it if I knocked off the extra 50 cents for it, because she would have to replace the blade anyway. He smiled. I was going to knock it off before she could say anything, but she got there first. James nodded. He was not surprised. She doing all right out there alone? Pete asked. The question was not unkind. It was the territory's version of looking in on someone. From what I can tell, James said. Pete nodded and moved on to whatever he had actually come in for. And James stood at the counter thinking about a woman who could negotiate down a plow price and identify a cracked blade, and still find time to ask a trading post operator why he stood up for people who could not stand up for themselves. He made a decision then. The kind of decision he recognized as significant even in the making of it, though he could not quite name all its dimensions yet. He decided to stop pretending he was not paying particular attention to Alice Bell and to simply pay it, honestly and without apology to himself. This was, for James Bancroft, as close as he generally got to admitting something. He did not act on this decision immediately, because that was not his way. He sat with it for several days, the way he sat with any decision that mattered, turning it over to make sure it was solid all the way through and not just solid on one side. He thought about what it would mean and what it might cost, and whether he was the right kind of person to be thinking about this particular thing. He thought about her children, who were part of the consideration and not separate from it, because Alice Bell came as Clara and Thomas included, and that was not a complication to be managed around but simply the shape of the thing. He thought about the fact that she was a widow, and that being a widow in 1873 in Texas was not a metaphor or a narrative description but a real condition with real weight and real daily difficulty, and that whatever she had been carrying since her husband's death, she had been carrying it mostly alone. He thought about the way she laughed. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after the question, he loaded a small paper sack with hard candy, the kind Clara had been looking at near the ribbon spools on her first visit, a small bright collection of cherry and lemon and wintergreen pieces. And when Alice Bell came in that afternoon with both children, he set it on the counter without comment. She looked at it. For the children, he said. Surplus from the last shipment. Silas cannot sell it fast enough. This was not true. The hard candy sold perfectly well. She looked at him for a moment. That is kind, she said. It is just candy, he said. Clara had materialized at his elbow with the uncanny speed of a child who has detected the word candy at 20 paces. Is that for us? She asked. If your mother says so, James said. Clara turned to her mother with an expression of absolute hopeful intensity. A few pieces, Alice said. Clara took a few pieces and then, with the thoughtfulness that James had noticed she possessed, she counted out an equal number for Thomas, who received them with the same solemn gravity with which he received everything. Alice was watching him, James noticed. Not the candy or the children, but him. There was a look on her face he could not quite categorize, something warm and careful and slightly uncertain, which was not an expression he had seen on her before because Alice Bell was usually certain about things. Mr. Bancroft, she said. Mrs. Bell, he said. The question I asked you last week, she said. I hope it was not impertinent. No, he said, it was exactly the right question. She tilted her head. You have been thinking about it. I have, he said. And she said. He looked at her. He had been thinking about how to answer this, and the answer he had found was not a speech or a history or an explanation. It was simpler than that. My mother was a widow, he said. She raised 3 children on this same frontier. She was taken advantage of by people who had more power and less conscience. I grew up watching it. He paused. I suppose I decided, somewhere along the way, that I would not be a person who did that, or a person who stood by while someone else did. Alice Bell looked at him steadily. She raised a good man, she said quietly. Something in James's chest moved in a way he was not accustomed to managing. She tried her best, he said, which was the most he generally allowed himself when it came to sentiment. Alice gathered her things unhurried, and then she said, My husband was a good man, too. He died of a fever 3 years ago when Thomas was just an infant. He did not take advantage of anyone in his life, and he did not stand by while others did either. She paused. I think good men come from specific places, from specific choosing. I think that too, James said. She picked up her bag. My neighbors are having a small gathering on Saturday evening, a few families from along the North Road. They have invited me. She said this in the direct, matter-of-fact way she said most things, but there was something beneath the directness, something that was asking without quite asking. I would feel more comfortable arriving with someone who knows the area. James looked at her. I could escort you, he said, and he said it the same way she had said the thing before it, direct and without trimming, because that was the register they had established between them and he knew it was the right one. That would be helpful, she said. Saturday evening, he said. I will come to the homestead at 6. 6, she said. She nodded, and it was not just the agreement to a time, and they both understood that, and neither of them said so. She left. Silas, who had been in the back room and had heard everything, came out and said absolutely nothing, which was the loudest thing James had ever heard him say. Saturday evening James arrived at the Dawson homestead, which was now the Bell homestead in all practical senses, at exactly 6 o'clock. He had left the trading post in Silas's capable if slow-moving hands and had gone to his room and put on his better shirt, which was not fancy but was clean and whole and had all its buttons. He had shaved, which he did regularly but had done with additional care today, and he had brought his good hat, the one without the sweat stain on the brim. The homestead was a quarter-mile off the North Road, reached by a track that was wide enough for a wagon, and the house, when it came into view, looked exactly as Alice had described it. Good bones but needing work. The roof on the south corner was visibly patched with a different kind of shingles, and one of the porch posts had been replaced recently, the new wood bright against the weathered gray of the original. But the yard was clean, and the small kitchen garden along the east side of the house was neatly worked, and there was a young oak tree near the porch that had had its lower dead branches cleared, which was the kind of thing you only did to a tree you intended to keep and sit under. Alice was on the porch when he arrived, in a dress he had not seen before, a deep green cotton with small white buttons at the collar, and she had done something different with her hair, not different in a way he could have described specifically, but in the way you notice when someone has taken care. Clara came out from behind her mother and looked at James with the same direct appraisal she always directed at him. "Your hat is nicer," she said. "Clara," Alice said. "It is nicer," James confirmed. "You have a good eye." Clara was pleased with this. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind his mother, then made his customary solemn wave at James, which James returned. "He is staying with Mrs. Harker next door," Alice said, which he took to mean Thomas was not coming to the gathering. "And me," Clara said, looking up. "You as well," Alice said, and Clara looked like she had mixed feelings about this but accepted it with good grace. They walked to the gathering, which was at the Henderson farm half a mile down the North Road, and James walked alongside Alice while the evening light went golden over the prairie, and the air smelled of dry grass and early summer. They talked easily, which surprised him, because easy conversation was not something he had much practice with. She asked him about the territory, about the land and the people, and he told her what he knew, which was quite a lot after 2 years of being the center of information flow for the entire district, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to everything. He asked her about Austin. She told him she had grown up there, had met her husband, a schoolteacher named Robert Bell, at a church social when she was 22. They had been married for 4 years. He had been 30 when he died of the fever, and she had been 26, and she had sold the Austin house and spent a year and a half trying to make things work in a rented house in San Marcos before she had finally decided that land of her own was the only thing that made sense. "You were not afraid?" he asked. "I was very afraid," she said. "That is not the same as it being the wrong decision." "No," he said, "it is not." The gathering was easy and warm. A dozen adults from the farms along the North Road, and James, who knew most of them at least in passing, found himself moving between introductions and conversations with Alice beside him in a way that felt natural, as though they had been doing this together for years. She fit into the room in the way she fit everywhere, with that combination of reserve and genuine interest that made people feel simultaneously respected and welcomed. On the walk back, the stars were out in full, the enormous undiluted stars of the Texas night that no one from an eastern city ever quite believed until they saw them. They walked slowly, because there was no reason to hurry. "Thank you for bringing me," she said. "It was my pleasure," he said, and meant it. She was quiet for a moment. "I have not gone anywhere in the company of someone other than my children in quite a long time," she said. "How long?" he asked. "Since before Robert died," she said. "He was not well for some time before the end. We did not go out much." James thought about that, about what it meant to go from being someone's companion to being alone, not suddenly but slowly, watching the person you had built your life around diminish and knowing the end of it. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it in the full, real sense, not the social form. "Thank you," she said. "He was a gentle man. He deserved better than what came for him." She paused. "I think about how to raise the children the way he would have wanted. I think about it all the time." "You are doing it," James said. She looked at him in the starlight. "How do you know?" she asked, not defensive, genuinely asking. "Clara," he said, "puts the ribbon back without being told twice, thinks about whether Thomas gets his fair share of candy, asks direct questions and listens to the answers." He paused. "Thomas waves at people he trusts." "Not at people he does not trust. I have noticed he does not wave at Harlan Voss." Alice laughed, the real laugh again, and it did the same thing to James it had done the first time, all the way down. "He is an excellent judge of character," she said. "He got it from somewhere," James said. She looked at him again, and there was something in her face in the starlight that was open and clear, and without the particular careful composure she usually carried, and James felt something in him that was unmistakable now, that had been unmistakable for some time, if he was being honest. They reached the Bell homestead. The house was dark and quiet, the children inside with Mrs. Harker, who would have put them to bed already. They stood on the porch steps. "I enjoyed tonight very much," Alice said. "So did I," James said. "I hope we can do something like it again," she said. She said it steadily, but he could see the slight effort the steadiness cost, the way the sentence was a little more formal than it needed to be because she was being careful with it. "We can," he said. "We will," she looked at him. "You sound very certain about that." "I am," he said, a pause. "Most men find the situation here too difficult," she said. "Two children. A homestead that needs work. A woman who has opinions about plow pricing. Most men have not lived here long enough to understand what actually matters," James said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does matter to you?" He considered. "Honest people," he said. "Solid work, a place to belong to." He paused. "Someone worth belonging to." The silence between them was the particular kind that has weight to it, that is full rather than empty. "Good night, Mr. Bancroft," she said at last. "Good night, Mrs. Bell," he said. He walked home under the full stars, and he was smiling, which was not something he did often enough for it to go unnoticed. But tonight, there was no one on the road to notice. Over the following weeks, which became the heart of summer with its fierce heat and long light, things between James and Alice Bell moved at the pace of people who were not young in years, but were young in the ways that mattered, careful and deliberate, but unmistakably forward. He escorted her to the gathering on the North Road, and then, a fortnight later, to a Sunday social at the church at the edge of town. They walked in the evening sometimes, when the heat had come off the day, and the prairie was cooling and gold, and they talked about everything, about the territory and its history and its people, about Robert Bell and James's mother, and the particular difficulty of raising children in a country still finding its shape, about books she had read and things he had seen on the cattle drives, and what they each thought mattered most in a life well lived. He started helping at the Bell homestead on Sunday mornings before the trading post opened, which was his one free morning of the week. He repaired the south corner of the roof, replaced a section of fence, helped her figure out the irrigation for the kitchen garden. He was careful about it, careful to offer rather than assume, careful to make the help feel collaborative rather than charitable, because he had watched the way unsolicited help could feel like pity, and he did not pity Alice Bell. He admired her enormously, and there was a significant difference between the two. Clara began teaching him, with great seriousness, a card game she had invented herself, the rules of which changed slightly every time in ways that always seemed to advantage her. This rule was different last week, James pointed out, one Sunday afternoon when Thomas was asleep and Alice was inside and Clara had set up her elaborate game system on the porch steps. "I improved it," Clara said. "Improved it in your favor," he said. Clara considered this. "Yes," she said without apology. He was quite fond of her. He was quite fond of all of them, and he was aware enough of himself by now to understand that quite fond was doing a great deal of carrying for a much larger feeling, the way a small word sometimes has to hold something enormous. In August, he told Alice about his mother. The whole story, not just the summary he had offered before. He told her about growing up in a two-room house outside of San Marcos, about the drought years when there had been very little food, and his mother had gone without to make sure they did not. About the time a man had come to collect a debt that James had later understood, as an adult, was not a legitimate debt at all, but an exploitation of a woman who was too tired and too alone to fight it. He told her about the day he had been 14 years old and had told the man, with a certainty he should not have had at 14 but somehow did, that he would not be coming back for the money, and had stood there until the man left. "What did your mother say?" Alice asked. They were sitting on the porch of the trading post, which was closed for the evening, the last of the daylight going purple over the flat land. "She did not say anything for a long time," James said. "And then she said that I had done right. And then she cried, which she almost never did." Alice was quiet. Then she said, "When did she pass?" 7 years ago," he said. "Pneumonia. She had done everything right and outlived it, and then something small got her in the end." He paused. "She was 51. Alice reached across the space between them and put her hand on his arm, briefly and firmly, the way she handled the children when they needed comfort, without dramatics. It was a gesture so simple and so right that he felt it more deeply than he could have explained. "She sounds like someone worth being made by," Alice said. "She was," he said. He covered her hand with his for a moment. She did not pull away. When she left that evening, he held her hand as she stepped down from the porch, the ordinary courtesy of the time, and then held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she let him. The following Sunday he kissed her. It was on the porch of the Bell homestead in the early morning, before the heat had fully arrived, after he had finished rehanging a door that had been sticking, while Clara was feeding the chickens and Thomas was watching her with intense scientific interest. Alice had brought him a cup of coffee, real coffee, which was not cheap, and which she had made for him specifically, and they were standing close together in the morning light, and James had looked at her and said quietly, "May I?" Because he was a man who believed in asking, and she had looked at him with those warm brown eyes and said yes. It was a brief kiss, careful and certain, and they were both a little breathless afterward, and then Thomas, who had turned away from the chickens at some point, was standing between them looking up at both of them with an expression of complete equanimity, and then he raised his hand in his customary solemn wave, apparently at both of them together. James looked down at him, then up at Alice. Alice was laughing, her hand over her mouth, her eyes brilliant. "He is endorsing the situation," James said. "He is extremely perceptive," Alice said through the laughter. They stood there in the morning light, and it was a very ordinary morning, summer birds and the smell of coffee and chickens in the yard, and it was also the best morning James had spent in as long as he could clearly remember. He proposed to Alice Bell on a September afternoon, 7 months after she had first walked through the trading post door. He did not do it dramatically or with elaborate preface. He did it the way he did most things that mattered, directly and without ceremony, because Alice Bell was not a woman who needed ceremony to know what was real. They were walking along the North Road in the evening. The children were ahead of them on the track, Clara chasing grasshoppers with the focused dedication of a child who has set a goal, Thomas following her at a slight remove and applauding her efforts. "I want to marry you," James said. She looked at him. "I want to marry you and help you build this place into what it ought to be," he said. "I want to be the children's, not their father. I would never claim Robert's place, but someone who is there, someone who is constant." He paused. "I know this is not a small thing to ask. I know what you have already survived on your own, and I am not suggesting you cannot continue to do it. I am suggesting that I would prefer very strongly that neither of us had to." Alice was looking at the children on the track ahead, and then she was looking at him, and there was the kind of light in her face that he had been watching grow over these months, something that had started cautious and was now unguarded. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am." "You have decided this," she said. "I have," he said. "What if I said no?" she said. And she was not playing a game or hedging. She was asking him a real question, because she was Alice Bell and she asked real questions. "Then I would respect it entirely," he said. "I would be deeply disappointed, and I would still come to fix your fence on Sundays for as long as you would let me." She laughed, that real laugh. "James," she said. "Alice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and they both heard it. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." He took her hand and she let him hold it, and they walked the rest of the way along the North Road in the evening light while Clara ahead of them finally caught a grasshopper and Thomas applauded magnificently. They were married in November of 1873, on a cool, clear Saturday with a sky that was the exact blue of a perfect day. The ceremony was at the Redrock Crossing church, which was small and wooden and lit inside by afternoon light through two east windows that turned everything warm. Silas Dobbins sat in the front row with the look of a man who had seen this coming and was thoroughly satisfied with himself. Clara stood up very straight as the flower girl and took the responsibility extremely seriously, and Thomas, who was now 4, sat between Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Harker, and waved periodically at various members of the congregation for reasons known only to himself. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, the families of the North Road, the regular customers of the trading post, a few of the people in town who had, over the months, seen something true unfolding and had wanted to be present for its completion. Pete Maddox was there. Owen Pratt was there with his wife. Even one or two of the people who had initially been skeptical about a widow setting up on 40 acres alone had come around, influenced partly by Alice Bell's relentless competence and partly by the way James Bancroft, the most unmovable man in the district, had clearly been entirely moved. Harlan Voss was not there, which suited everyone. When Alice walked down the aisle in her good dress, the deep green one with the white buttons, which she had added new lace trim to for the occasion, James stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and felt something settle into place in him that had been unsettled for a very long time, something he had not even known was unsettled, until he felt it finally find its ground. She reached him. She was calm and steady, Alice Bell all the way through to the center, no trembling or theatrical emotion, just clear, warm certainty in her eyes. "You look beautiful," he said quietly just for her. "You are wearing your good hat," she said equally quietly. He almost laughed, which would have been the most undignified thing he had ever done at a church ceremony, and he held it together out of pure stubbornness. The ceremony was brief and real. When the minister asked if there was any impediment and the church was quiet, Thomas said from the pew, "No," in a small but carrying voice, and the church burst into warm laughter, and Alice and James looked at each other and grinned, and that was the whole truth of it. The reception was held in the Henderson barn, cleared out and strung with lanterns, and there was fiddle music and food that half the settlement had contributed to and dancing on the swept plank floor. James danced, which was something he had not done in years, first with Alice, who danced with the same compact efficiency she brought to everything, and also with a lightness that surprised and delighted him. And then with Clara, who took the occasion very seriously and counted the steps under her breath. And then with Mrs. Harker, because she was 70 and deserved it. Thomas fell asleep in a corner on a pile of blankets someone had arranged for him, and he slept through 3 fiddle songs and only woke up when someone accidentally knocked over a butter churn. And even then he only opened his eyes, assessed the situation, found it satisfactory, and went back to sleep. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had begun to drift home, and the fiddle had gone quiet, and the lanterns were burning low, James and Alice stood together outside the barn in the cool November dark, and she was leaning against him, and he had his arm around her, and they could hear Clara still inside talking with enormous energy to Mrs. Henderson's daughter about something that was clearly very important. "She will talk until someone stops her," Alice said. "She comes by it honestly," James said, and felt Alice laugh against his side. "Are you saying I talk too much?" she said. "I am saying you talk exactly the right amount," he said, "which is different from most people." She tilted her head up to look at him. "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about the question the way he thought about everything she asked him, because she asked questions that deserved to be answered properly and not just quickly. "Yes," he said, "I am." He paused, "more than I knew to want to be." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were out above them, the same enormous Texas stars. "So am I," she said. And she said it with the same straightforward completeness that she brought to everything, not as a performance but as a simple true fact, and he believed it entirely. The winter of 1873 going into 1874 was the first winter James had spent with a clear sense of where he was going. He moved into the Bell homestead, and it became the Bancroft homestead in name, and in fact, though Alice kept Bell in her use of it because it had been her purchase, and she was rightly proud of that. James kept working at the trading post through the week, and came home to the homestead each evening to a lamp in the window, and the smell of whatever Alice had made for supper, and Clara's running account of the day's events, and Thomas's solemn examination of whatever object had interested him most in the past few hours. And it was the most ordinary life imaginable, and it was extraordinary. Silas, who was aging more noticeably now, and who had begun hinting with increasing directness that he was thinking about what would happen to the trading post when he could no longer run it, had a conversation with James in January about the possibility of James buying into ownership. The amount they discussed was fair, and James had savings, not a lot but enough for a share, and they shook hands on it with the simplicity of 2 men who trusted each other, which was the only kind of agreement James considered binding anyway. Alice, when he told her, was immediately practical. "We will need to see the actual ledgers," she said. "Not because I distrust Silas, but because you should know exactly what you are buying into." "I have seen the ledgers," James said. "I have been keeping them for 2 years." She looked at him. "Then you know what you are buying into." "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "And then I am very pleased for you. It is yours in all the ways that matter. It should be yours in the legal way too." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the winter wind was making its run across the flat country, and inside the lamp was burning, and Clara was doing her arithmetic homework with her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and Thomas was already asleep. In the spring of 1874, Alice told James she was expecting. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, with the matter-of-fact directness that was her way with important information. And then she watched his face with the slight uncertainty of someone who is delivering news they hope will be received well, and is not quite sure. James looked at her for a moment, and then something happened in his face that Clara, who happened to be watching from the doorway, later described to Mrs. Henderson's daughter as him looking like when you tell someone very good news and they are trying not to make too much of a fuss. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and he held her, carefully and firmly, and she put her arms around him and they stood like that in the morning kitchen for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I have done this before, twice." "You have," he said. "You are very good at it." She laughed against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. The same question she had asked on their wedding night. "Yes," he said. "Same answer." "Same answer," she said. Clara, from the doorway, made a noise that was her version of approving, and Thomas, who had followed her from the bedroom, waved at them. The summer and autumn of 1874 moved with the particular forward momentum of a life that has found its shape. The trading post, now partly James's own, ran well. The homestead grew. Alice planted more of the south field than they had managed the year before, and the kitchen garden was twice the size of its first version. James built an extension on the barn with help from Owen Pratt and 2 other men from the North Road, and the work was done in 2 weekends with reasonable cursing and unreasonable amounts of food that Alice and Mrs. Pratt and Mrs. Henderson organized and produced together in a way that made it clear the women were running the actual operation. In October, the baby came. He was born on a windy Tuesday, healthy and loud, with James's dark hair and Alice's broad forehead, and he arrived with the decisive confidence of a person who had somewhere to be. The midwife, Mrs. Harker, who had delivered more children in this district than she could count, declared him perfect, and Clara stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at her new brother with the expression of someone doing rapid mental recalculations about their position in the family order, and then said, with the directness she had never entirely gotten around to containing, "He is very loud." "He is," James agreed. He was sitting beside the bed where Alice lay, holding the baby, who was already quieting in the particular way babies quiet when they feel something right beneath them. He was looking at Alice, who was tired but clear-eyed and looking back at him with the same look she had worn the morning he kissed her on the porch, unguarded and entirely present. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names but not decided. James had a name in mind that he had been holding quietly the way he held most things, waiting for the right moment. "Henry," he said, "if you are agreeable." She looked at him. "After your father, my mother's father," he said. He was the one person who treated her the way she deserved to be treated, consistently, without exception. Alice's expression did something complicated and warm. "Henry," she said, looking at the baby. "Hello, Henry." Henry, who was by now entirely asleep, did not respond, but Thomas, who was standing at James's knee looking at his new brother with the focused scientific attention he brought to everything, raised his hand in the solemn wave. Clara said, "I am going to teach him cards." "Give him a few years," James said. "I will have better rules by then," Clara said, and went to look at the baby more closely. And there was something in her face that was pure love without performance, the realest kind. By the time Henry was walking, which he did at an early age and with the determined efficiency of a child who has decided that crawling is beneath him, the Bancroft homestead was something considerably more substantial than the Dawson place Alice had taken up in the spring of 1873. The house had been extended to accommodate the family. The fields were productive. The trading post was James's by full partnership now, as Silas had decided that 70 was a fine age to hand over the heavier portions of the work and to spend his time sitting on the porch dispensing opinions, which he did with great dedication. Clara was 8 and attending the new school that had opened in Redrock Crossing that year, taught by a young woman from San Antonio who had an education degree and the kind of composed ferocity of a person who intended to make something of a difficult assignment. Clara was, predictably, her most engaged student, and also the most likely to argue with her about points of interpretation, and the teacher, whose name was Miss Alvarez, handled this by arguing back with equal rigor, which Clara considered the highest form of respect. Thomas was 6, and at school as well, and was considerably quieter than Clara in a classroom, but was, his teacher had told Alice and James, one of the most observant children she had encountered. He noticed things. He remembered things. He understood things without being told, which was a quality that Miss Alvarez said would serve him extremely well if the world could manage to deserve it. James had heard this and said, quietly to Alice on the walk home, "He gets that from you." "He gets the stubbornness from you," she said. "Thomas is not stubborn," James said. "He is exactly stubborn," Alice said. "He simply does it quietly, which is worse." James thought about this and decided she was right. Henry, at 2, was neither quiet nor calculating. He was loud and cheerful and physical, a child built for rolling down gentle hills and chasing dogs and causing chaos with an expression of total innocence. He had James's jaw and Alice's laugh, and he used both to maximum effect. One Sunday afternoon in the late summer of 1876, James was sitting on the porch of the homestead in the clean gold light of the late afternoon. Henry was asleep inside. Thomas was in the yard, sitting very still in the way he did, watching a horned lizard on a rock with the patience of someone conducting genuine research. Clara was at the Henderson farm for the afternoon. Alice came out and sat beside him, and for a while they just sat together in the way of people who have been together long enough that sitting together without speaking is its own kind of conversation. "Are you thinking?" she asked after a while. "Always," he said. "About anything in particular?" He looked at the yard, at Thomas and the lizard, at the fields beyond, at the land that was their land now in the full sense of the word, that he had helped work and protect and make productive. "The question you asked me," he said. "The first year, in the store." She was quiet, and he knew she knew which question. "I have a better answer now," he said. She looked at him. "I do it because people deserve to be treated with dignity," he said. "Not because of who they are or how much they have or whether they can pay for the privilege of it. Every person who comes through that trading post door deserves a fair transaction and some basic decency, and I happen to be in a position to ensure that, and that is the reason. The original reason. The one that was always there." He paused. "But I also think now that it is something else as well. I think it is because I was watching for someone who would ask me the question." Alice looked at him for a long moment. "You were not watching for anyone," she said. "You were the most closed-off man in the territory." "Yes," he said. "Watching is not always obvious." She was quiet. "Then you think you were waiting for me?" "I think," James said carefully, "that I had built a very particular shape to my life and that it had a particular gap in it, and I did not know about the gap until you walked through the door and asked me a question I could not answer, and then I knew." Alice Bell, who was now Alice Bancroft and who had been Alice Bancroft for 3 years, and who wore it as easily as she wore her own name, looked at him with that open, unguarded expression that he had now seen many hundreds of times, and that still moved him every single time. "I did not come to Redrock Crossing looking for anyone," she said. "I came to build something. I came to give my children stable ground to grow on. I came to stop being in someone else's situation and to be in my own." She paused. "But I will tell you something. The first time I walked into that trading post and you looked up from your manifest, I thought, there is a man who means what he says." "High praise," he said. "For me it is the highest," she said. I had experienced the other kind. He took her hand. She held it. "And then I asked you the question," she said, "and you did not have the answer, and that was when I knew." "What did you know?" he asked. "That you were honest enough to say so," she said. "Most men would have made something up." "I considered it," he admitted. "I know," she said. "I could see you considering it. And then you told the truth instead." She smiled. That was the moment. He looked at her, this woman who had walked into his trading post with 2 children and a careful list, and 73 cents short of what she needed, and who had changed every fixed and settled thing about the life he had decided he was living, not by force or drama, but by the simple, radical act of asking him something real and waiting for a real answer. "I love you," he said. He said it simply, because that was the only way to say a true thing. "I love you," she said back in the same register, and they both knew it was not a small statement dressed in plain words but a large thing wearing its truest form. Thomas, in the yard, made a small pleased sound. They looked over. The horned lizard had climbed onto his hand, apparently of its own initiative, and Thomas was looking at it with an expression of profound satisfaction. He looked up at his parents and raised his free hand in the wave. James waved back. Alice laughed, and then he laughed with her, and the evening light moved over the homestead and the flat land beyond it, and in the distance the trading post sat at the crossing of two roads, solid and square and lit by the low sun. By 1878, the town of Redrock Crossing had grown in the way of frontier towns that find themselves correctly positioned on a useful road. There were two more stores, a proper doctor's office, a school that was no longer held in the church and had its own building with two classrooms, and a weekly newspaper that was printed on a small press by a young man named Daniel Tuck, who had come from Missouri with ambitions and ink-stained hands. The trading post remained the center of things, as trading posts do in such places, and James ran it now with full ownership, having bought Silas's remaining share the previous year when Silas had announced, with great finality, that he was moving to San Antonio to live with his daughter. The handshake at the end of that transaction had been between two men who had become, over years, something more than employer and employee and something more than friends. It was the handshake of people who have been important to each other in the quiet, consistent way that does not make good stories but makes good lives. "Take care of it," Silas had said. "I will," James had said. "Take care of her too," Silas said, in the tone of someone who knows this is redundant but is going to say it anyway. "Silas," James said. "I am going," Silas said, and got into the wagon. Clara was 11 now and had become, in the way of certain children who take their intelligence seriously, someone who was actively becoming who she was going to be. She read everything she could find. She had opinions, worked out and defensible ones, about everything from crop rotation to the teaching of arithmetic to the particular injustice of laws that did not apply equally to everyone in a territory, including the native peoples who had lived on this land before anyone had drawn lines across it and decided who owned which portion. James had listened to Clara's developing arguments on these points with genuine respect, because he believed in addressing injustices honestly, which Clara appreciated. The treatment of the Tonkawa and Comanche peoples by land policies and by the army was something James had seen enough of on the frontier to understand in its real, human dimensions, and when Clara asked him about it with the focused intensity she brought to things she cared about, he told her what he knew and what he thought and what he did not know, and she listened and added it to the ongoing project she was making of her understanding of the world. "She is going to be a lawyer," James said to Alice one evening. "She is going to be whatever she decides," Alice said, "but yes, probably a lawyer." Thomas was 9, and he had developed a quiet passion for the natural world, for the plants and animals of the prairie, for the way the land worked and changed. He had begun keeping a journal of observations in a small notebook James had brought him from the trading post, neat, careful notes about the weather and the birds and the plants he found, the kind of notes that were scientific before he had the word for it. Henry was 4, and he remained his full and cheerful self, a child built from the best parts of both his parents, with the stubbornness and the directness and also the warmth and the laugh, in a combination that made him, James thought privately, a small force of nature. In 1879, Alice told him she was expecting again. He was behind the counter of the trading post when she came in to tell him, as she sometimes still did with things she wanted to tell him in the place where they had begun. She waited until the store had a quiet moment, and then she came to the counter and looked at him with that warm, knowing look she had, and he knew before she said anything. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. He came around the counter and held her there in the trading post the way he had in the kitchen 5 years before, careful and certain. "How many children do you intend for us to have?" he asked into her hair. "I have not decided," she said. "Of course you have not decided," he said, and she laughed. The fourth child was a girl, born in the early spring of 1880, with Alice's brown eyes and James's dark hair, and a disposition that combined in some new configuration the best elements of both parents. They named her Margaret after James's mother, and Alice cried when he suggested the name, the way she cried for things she had not expected to affect her, quickly and honestly and without embarrassment. Margaret grew up, in the years that followed, as the youngest of 4 children on a homestead that was now properly a farm, a working, productive farm with good land and honest people, and a trading post at the crossing of 2 roads that was the center of a community James Bancroft had never expected to be the center of, but had become, the way you become things when you stay somewhere and care about it honestly. Clara went east for school at 17, to a women's college in Missouri, which James and Alice made possible by the accumulated work of years, and which Silas, when he heard about it in a letter from San Antonio, said he had expected and was deeply pleased about. She came back 3 years later with a law degree, which was unusual in 1897 for a woman but was something Clara had known was going to happen since she was 11, and which she proceeded to use in the service of exactly the things she had argued about around the Bancroft kitchen table: land rights and fair treatment, and the equal application of law. Thomas stayed close, which was what he had always wanted. He took up land of his own adjacent to the homestead and became, in the way of men with patient, observant natures and a deep knowledge of the land, a farmer of considerable skill. He married a quiet, thoughtful woman named Helen, who had come to Redrock Crossing as the school teacher after Miss Alvarez married and moved north, and who understood Thomas's particular relationship with silence and found it restful rather than difficult. Henry became, in due course, the most outgoing Bancroft, a man who took his father's stubbornness and his mother's directness and his own natural warmth, and turned them into a talent for dealing with people that made him, as a young man, invaluable at the trading post, which James eventually passed to him in the way Silas had passed it to James. With a handshake and a quiet word, and the understanding that some things are larger than individual lives, but only stay large because specific people take care of them. Margaret, the youngest, was a teacher. She taught in Redrock Crossing for 40 years and shaped more children than she could count, in the same school that had been built when she was a child, and she did it with the combination of genuine care and absolute clarity that her mother had always brought to things that mattered. James Bancroft lived to be an old man. He was 68 when he finally stopped working at the trading post every day, and he stopped only because Alice told him. He had earned the right to sit on the porch in the mornings if he wanted to, and because he found, to his own surprise, that he wanted to. He sat on the porch of the homestead in the mornings, in the later years, and watched the land that was theirs, that had become theirs through work and time and the accumulation of ordinary days, and he thought about things with the same unhurried thoroughness he had always brought to thinking. Alice sat beside him on those mornings. She was 63 in 1908, the year he finally put down the daily work, and she was still entirely herself, still direct and warm and clear-eyed, still the person who asked the real question and waited for the real answer. Her hair was nearly all silver now, and she wore it pinned up the same way she always had, and her hands were the hands of someone who had worked good land for decades, strong and capable, and he thought them beautiful. Clara was practicing law in Austin and sending long, brilliant letters home about cases and politics and the ongoing project of justice, which she treated as a personal obligation. Thomas and Helen had 3 children of their own, living on the adjacent land, and the grandchildren made the homestead loud on Sundays in the best possible way. Henry and his wife ran the trading post, which had grown since James's time but had kept its character, the same honest place at the crossing of 2 roads. Margaret was teaching. The world had changed, was changing, was in the ongoing process of becoming something different, which was what the world did, and which James had made his peace with in the way of people who have built something sturdy enough to survive change and flexible enough to participate in it. He looked at Alice on a morning in September in the cool before the day fully arrived, and she was looking at the land, the wide flat land under the wide flat sky, and there was something in her face that was everything she had always been plus all the years on top of it, and he felt the same thing he had felt the first time he had heard her real laugh in the trading post, all the way down to the soles of his boots. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. She turned to look at him. "All of it? Is it enough?" he asked, the question she had asked him over and over in different forms since that first October. She looked at him for a long moment with those warm brown eyes that had been looking at him honestly for 35 years. "It is exactly enough," she said. "It is more than I knew to ask for." "Same answer," he said. "Same answer," she said. And they sat together on the porch of the homestead in the September morning, the two of them, in the easy quiet of people who have built something real and lasting and true, while the prairie went gold around them, and the town of Redrock Crossing went about its ordinary, essential life, and the trading post at the crossing of two roads opened its doors as it always had and always would, and somewhere in the house behind them they could hear the beginning sounds of a household waking up and starting a new day. And it was, in every possible sense, exactly right.